Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Nai. I'm here to introduce our keynote speaker, the David Fear presentation. So Dr. Caitlin Berner is our presenter today. Caitlin's traveling all the way from Vancouver to join us today. She's an assistant professor with the Division of Developmental Pediatrics at UBC, and she's an investigator with the BC Children's Hospital Research Institute, and also provides care to children as a psychologist in the complex pain service at BC Children's. Caitlin completed a PhD in clinical psychology at Dalhousie University under Dr. Christine Chambers. She did her residency in child clinical psychology at CHEO, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at UBC. Her research focuses on making pain research and care accessible and equitable to young people. And she's very interested in understanding the role of sex, gender, and neurodiversity on pain. She's a recognized leading expert in the application of gender in pediatric pain research and has been recognized with awards from the IASP and CHIR. She's actively involved in leadership positions in sex, gender, and racial differences in pain special interest group in the IASP, and also the gender health specialist interest group with the Society of Pediatric Psychology. On a personal note, in addition to her work, she's an amateur pianist. She is a fair weather runner and a proud mom of a very adorable kindergartner. And she's always on the hunt for amazing coffee as well. So it's my pleasure to turn over to Dr. Berner for her presentation.
Practice, pain looks something like this. Pain is incredibly diverse experience, and the young people who experience pain are also diverse. And it's not a new idea to anyone that pain is a biopsychosocial phenomenon, and that the fact that there's multiple factors that intersect to create the pain experience is something that is well known and appreciated. But when we're working with children and families, we really have to think about pain as being a biopsychosocial developmental phenomenon. This is an image from a paper that just came out last month that I worked on with Neil Schechter and Tim Oberlander, where we were putting forward this idea of pain as a developmental phenomenon, and that, this is particularly apparent in children and youth, but really across the lifespan, that you can't think about pain as being something that's static, and you can't think about the factors that influence pain as being factors that will have an equal level of influence over the course of a childhood or a lifetime. So what we've illustrated here are a variety of biopsychosocial factors, as well as some developmental milestones that impact the pain experience. And what we've attempted to illustrate is what we hypothesize to be the weight of influence that those different factors would have relative to each other over the course of childhood and adolescence. And so you'll see, for example, biological factors play a very large role in the pain experience early in life. And then once we are kind of entering childhood, there's more factors related to psychology and psychosocial experiences. But then we see a bit of an uptick again in the role of biology once we hit puberty. And so, this, I think, really illustrates the fact that when we're thinking about pain experience, we have to be thinking about how each child is different, but also how that child will also be different over the course of their childhood. And so thinking about pain in a bit more of a flexible way. And one of the developmental phenomena that really got me interested in looking at the role of these developmental factors is the fact that we see sex differences emerge over the course of development. So what I'm presenting here is some data that's compiled from a number of different papers that tracked the incidence of various chronic pain conditions over time. You'll see, because they're from different papers, the lines don't always line up, different method populations, but what this attempts to illustrate is that, earlier in development, sort of pre-puberty, we don't tend to see large sex differences. And then those sex differences that become quite pronounced in adulthood really tend to emerge around the time of puberty. And this is a well-documented phenomenon. It's pretty consistent across chronic, acute, and experimental pain. And because this split emerges around the time of puberty, the kind of prevailing hypothesis is that it's related to sex hormones. And I think certainly there's a sex hormone role there, but in thinking about the diversity in the young people that we see, it really kind of behooves us to think a little bit broader than just a single factor influencing this difference in prevalence. And even though this paper is 10 years old now, I continue to be inspired by the work of Greta Bauer, who is a real leader in the application of intersectionality to health research. And I think this quote sums up very nicely how I've been trying to think about sex differences and how we can explain them with a bit more nuance. And Dr. Bauer says, within sex and gender research, research on inequities is often seen as confirming expectations of obvious biological differences, with little attention given to verifying biological similarities, distinguishing the effects of biologically sex mechanisms from gendered social processes, or allowing for their interaction. And so this is speaking, specifically about how we need to integrate a sex and gender perspective to better understand a health outcome. And I would argue that, and I think Dr. Bauer would also argue that looking at just sex and gender alone without considering the multitude of other social positions and factors that can influence a health outcome is probably missing some of the nuance that helps explain the heterogeneity that we see in pain presentations. So this is a framework that we put out earlier this year where we attempted to summarize the research that's available on factors that are influenced by sex and gender over the course of development that lead to eventual health outcomes. And in the paper, we talk about child health outcomes in general, but also use pain as a specific example of how we can apply this way of thinking to looking at the pain research that might help us to understand why sex differences emerge around puberty. And I think what's really important about this is that, we've got all of these different factors. We've tried to order them in terms of maybe the point of onset of their influence, roughly. And you'll see sort of that blue line becomes more pronounced as it moves along, as we kind of consider the fact that all these factors are layering on top of each other. But we've also tried to position it within this broader kind of intersectionality framework, thinking that, something like gender identity development doesn't always make sense to even think about that as being something separate from an individual's race or ethnicity, their culture, their religion, and socioeconomic status. So what I'm hoping to do over the next few slides is to summarize a little bit of the literature that informed this framework and why we're trying to think about the influence of sex and gender beginning far earlier than puberty, even if we don't see these differences reliably expressing themselves until puberty and beyond. And then in the second half of my talk, I want to focus a little bit on some of the work that my group is doing to try and address some of the gaps in our knowledge. Some of these factors have a lot more evidence to support them than others. And I'd like to share a little bit about how we've been trying to address that. So we know even from gestation and the perinatal development period that there's influences that exert themselves in a sex-specific way that can then influence later pain outcomes. And there's a lot more than what I've listed here. I just wanted to give a little snapshot of some of the research that's available. We know that male babies are more likely to be born preterm and have early complications than female babies, and therefore experiencing more painful procedures in early life, which then can lead to sensitization of the pain system and neurobiological differences later on in how pain is processed. But some work from Sue Ellen Walker's group in the UK has also shown that young adults who are born extremely premature show decreased pain sensitivity in males and increased in females, and that this is especially obvious if they underwent neonatal surgery. So there's clearly something that's happening over the course of development that is exerting a sex-specific effect from these early experiences. And I think this is a really nice example of how, if we're only looking at the period of puberty and beyond, we're probably missing some important factors. We don't have a ton of research on genetics and epigenetics, so it's growing in terms of pain research. and specifically around sex and gender influences. But there is some research to suggest that there's an increased vulnerability for female rats and increased resilience for male rats in terms of the impact of early life stressors on their gene expression related to visceral sensitivity. So again, if we're thinking about, epigenetics in particular, it makes a lot of sense to be looking at an earlier time period than just focusing on puberty and beyond. Adverse childhood experiences we know are very important in understanding later pain, chronic pain development and pain sensitization. And even though lifetime rates of trauma exposure are higher in boys and men, adverse childhood experiences are more frequent and also more complex, so have multiple components or multiple traumatic experiences in girls and gender diverse youth. So the exposure is not equally divided. There's also sex differences that have been observed in biobehavioral responses to pain in rodents following adverse childhood experiences, and some recent research that suggests that early accumulation of these adverse pain experiences is a better predictor of pain in adolescent girls than boys. This one I think might be a little bit more obvious or well known, but there's a female predominance in many pain conditions. And it's perhaps not a coincidence that many of these conditions are also ones that come with a lot of stigma attached to them. For conditions that are more common in boys, like cerebral palsy, girls still tend to report more pain. And there's also differences in injury prevalence. So boys are more likely to get injured than girls, but also the factors that are associated with persistent symptoms post-injury. So girls are more who have higher levels of somatization are more likely to experience persistent concussion symptoms. Whereas for boys, the best predictor of those persistent concussion symptoms is a history of insomnia and then amnesia related to the accident. When we think about how gender develops and how our perception of gender develops, so how the roles that we're exposed to and the expectations put on us are influenced by our social context. It's important to understand that even before we see reliable sex differences in children's pain experiences, we see gender biases in pain assessment. And this study that I've cited here, I think, is a particularly striking example of that. They showed people the same video of a pretty androgynous looking child receiving a painful procedure. They told half of the people that the child's name was Samantha and the other half that the child's name was Samuel. And those who thought the child's name was Samuel rated his pain as being higher than if they were told that the child's name was Samantha. And this was in a child that was, I think, about 5 or 6 years old, which is before we would be seeing reliable sex differences in the child's report of pain. And this phenomenon has been seen across a number of different experimental and clinical paradigms. Some work for my dissertation with Christine Chambers found that girls are more susceptible to the influence of exaggerated pain behaviors in parents, the theory being that they might be a little bit more attuned to the social cues and how pain modeling is transmitted socially. Some work from Melanie Knowles' group has shown that children's media depicts male and female pain differently. And some really interesting work showing that adolescent boys withdraw from contact with girls when experiencing pain. So there's clearly, some social factors and that are exerting a role. And if we think about how some of these biases are present from very early in life, it's hard to imagine that you're not influenced by that when you're being exposed, especially during an age where you're, understanding your place in the world and what people are expecting of you. The literature on sex differences in brain development and function is not super straightforward. In relation to pain, there's some research to suggest that there's sex-differentiated roles of the amygdala in pain modulation. Also, some work suggesting that children who have chronic pain show sex differences in their sensory motor network and emotion regulation network. But we know certainly that there's differences in cognition and perception in relation to how physical symptoms are experienced, so interoception, and that girls tend to remember pain in a more negatively biased way. I'm going to talk a little bit more about gender diversity when I'm sharing some of the results of our own work, but there's a well-documented evidence base on the the fact that female symptoms, and particularly pain, are often delegitimized, so not taken seriously, and often more likely to be attributed to psychopathology, whereas male symptoms are more likely to be attributed to medical causes. And then folks are offered treatments in accordance with those etiological assumptions. And we also know for girls and women that there tends to be a discouragement of assertiveness for advocacy. So asking for support with your pain is not seen as a typically feminine or appropriate behavior. But we also know that living with chronic pain, and I think this is important because if you're living with chronic pain throughout your adolescent period, it's going to have a particularly significant impact on your identity development. There's this described demasculinizing effect of living with chronic pain, where if pain is interrupting your ability to engage in what you would think of as being sort of stereotypical masculine activities, that can really cause some conflict between how an individual perceives their own gender identity and how they're actually able to express that. We know there's a strong link between chronic pain and mental health, and chronic pain is more likely to be associated with internalizing disorders in girls. So this would be things like anxiety and depression, and more likely to be associated with externalizing disorders in boys. That would be things like behavioral or learning attentional difficulties. And a couple of years ago, we analyzed some data from RCTs that were included in the Cochrane reviews for psychological treatments for chronic pain, and disaggregated the data by sex, and found that among samples of young people who are referred for psychological therapy for chronic pain, there's higher pretreatment emotional distress, both anxiety and depression, in girls who are referred for psychology treatment for chronic pain than boys. And we've always had this question about whether, is that a reporting bias? Are boys less likely to disclose if they're having anxiety or depression symptoms? Or are we perhaps not measuring the right outcomes? So we very rarely measure things like anger in pain research, which might be a more comfortable emotion for boys to express, just given how they're socialized. And then finally, I've tried to steer us away from focusing solely on puberty, but it is important, and we know there is a strong link between sex hormones and pain experience. Testosterone in particular has a demonstrated anti-nociceptive effect, which has been hypothesized to be one of the reasons why we don't see the same increase in chronic pain conditions in boys as they're undergoing puberty. And also things like early puberty and the impact of having painful menstrual cycle associated with increased risk of various chronic pain conditions in girls. So there's definitely a lot of important factors happening in puberty. We do tend to focus on the biological aspects of puberty, but it's also important to remember that puberty is a really critical period of identity development, of autonomy and individuation from family, of engaging socially in a different way with peers, and understanding one's own identity and self. So I mentioned that some of these areas have more evidence than others, and the paper is really long, too long. It was like a second dissertation. I would never write another one of these papers again, but I do recommend that you check it out if you're interested in seeing where the evidence lies. But we've tried to summarize it in this table here. So you'll see there's overall health. So that's, any health outcome that we looked at. And then there's pain specifically, and we've split it by where's the evidence for a sex effect, where's the evidence for a gender effect. And the black circles are where we have evidence to really clearly demonstrate the link between that domain and a sex and gender effect on health. Where there's gray circles, that's where evidence is extrapolated from the adult literature. So we do have some evidence to suggest there's an effect, but we're maybe missing that developmental component. And then the white circles are where there's a really strong kind of hypothesized rationale, but a need for further research. The evidence is just not there, or not trustworthy enough. And so I hope that this has convinced you that it's important to look earlier than puberty for potential sex and gender influences and the developmental pathways to pain. And I think this also suggests that we really need to be doing more work understanding some of these factors specifically that have been harder to study. So things like gender identity development doesn't lend itself particularly well to an experimental paradigm, but we're making some good advances on doing that work and also understanding the role of intersectionality. So I want to shift to talking about some work that we're doing to try and fill in some of these gaps. And the first piece that I want to talk about is related to gender diversity and chronic pain in youth. So the majority of the research that we reviewed in that framework paper was focused on cisgender or presumed cisgender samples. It's always really hard to tease this apart because very often we're not consistent about our use of terminology. The way that gender is measured is sometimes problematic, sometimes conflated with sex. But when we're looking at, what are assumed to be sex differences, it's very hard to say anything about the experiences of gender diverse people. And I'll use the term trans and gender diverse, or TGD, to refer to any young person whose gender identity doesn't align with the sex they were assigned at birth. So there's a number of reasons why we might expect pain experiences and the contributors to pain to look different in trans and gender diverse youth. There's some unique sources of pain. So there's pain associated with forms of social transition and gender affirmation, things like chest binding, genital tucking, postural changes to hide or enhance a part of the body. These are all experiences that can be and are well documented to be associated with pain. There's also pain associated with gender affirming medical care. So if a young person is on hormone injections, there's also post-surgical pain if there's gender affirming surgeries that are being performed. This is less common in youth, but definitely a consideration for gender diverse people. The hormonal effects. So I just mentioned how we know that sex hormones have an impact on pain processing. There's some research in the adult literature to suggest that when you're undergoing a hormonal therapy for gender affirmation, that it does change your experience of pain, both chronic pain and experimental pain. But we have no data on this in youth. We also know that trans and gender diverse youth have, unfortunately, increased exposure to violence and trauma that can be both directly to them and then sort of vicariously or indirectly through exposure to transphobic narratives in media. They also have different experiences of accessing healthcare and not always receiving healthcare that's affirming or having their symptoms taken seriously. Like cisgender youth, trans and gender diverse youth experience co-occurring psychiatric, medical, and neurodevelopmental conditions that might impact their pain experience. And there's some emerging evidence to suggest that there's certain conditions that might be more prevalent in TGD youth. And all of this really needs to be understood in the context of minority stressors. So a lot of the work that has been done has been very damage-centered and very focused on individual factors and often misses sort of the broader social context in which these stressors are experienced, and that having something like a diverse gender identity is really not all that problematic if you're in an affirming environment, but if you're in an environment where you're constantly being questioned about whether you actually truly know who you are, or you're being denied access to the things that help you to feel like yourself. And then that combination of encountering that sort of cis-normative approach, as well as ableism associated with living with a chronic pain condition, is sort of a perfect storm for minority stress. Myself and some colleagues have summarized all of this in a framework. You can tell I love frameworks, but I think it really highlights where we have the evidence and where we don't, and where we can draw evidence from other areas of research and which aspects are really specific to this population. What I'll highlight here is that we've really tried to frame socio-ecological factors that drive risk and resilience for chronic pain. And you'll see again, like most of these factors are not unique to gender diverse youth, but might be experienced differently by gender diverse youth. And then the pain-related psychosocial factors, again, are things that would mostly be experienced by cisgender youth as well, but those gendered expectations around pain might look different. And all of these are known to influence pain outcomes. But I think importantly, one piece that we've added in here that some of the recent work from my lab and some work that Lauren Harrison at Stanford has been doing is showing that there's gender-related resilience factors. So young people who live with chronic pain, who identify as gender diverse, talk about how having opportunities for gender euphoria, so the kind of joy and satisfaction that comes from being able to live in line with your gender identity is a really powerful buffer against the negative experiences associated with chronic pain. So I think this is an important piece to highlight because of this sort of historically damage-centered narrative around trans healthcare. And I think, looking for those opportunities to highlight resilience factors is so important in how we approach treatment for these young people. So we have a qualitative study looking at chronic pain in trans and gender diverse youth that's currently in press in the journal Pediatrics, where we wanted to just ask TGD youth who live with chronic pain about their experiences of gender, of pain, of accessing healthcare, and sort of what they saw as priorities for research in this area. We recruited young people who lived in BC. We tried to recruit very broadly. Initially, we were going to look just at young people who were either accessing our chronic pain clinic, where we do see a large number of trans and gender diverse youth, or those who were accessing our gender clinic at BC Children's. But what we realized is that that's actually quite a biased sample in terms of who has access to tertiary care health services, and also that there's some trans and gender diverse youth who don't seek out gender affirming medical care for a variety of reasons, either because it's not feeling like the relevant next step to them, or maybe they're not out to their family. So we really tried to think about recruiting more broadly, and I think we were pretty successful with that. And I think that's also in part to the fact that we gave lots of really flexible options for participation. This was very important to us. We did it in close consultation with our research ethics board, but we felt it was important to have things in place like being able to do a capacity assessment to determine if the young person could consent to their own participation, so that they wouldn't have to potentially out themselves to their family to be able to participate in this research. And, we were very thoughtful about this. I won't go into too much detail, but I'm happy to answer questions about it. But we, really wanted to prioritize both the safety of participants as well as the opportunity for them to have autonomy in their own research participation. And it was nice to see that there was both some youth who really appreciated that and some youth who appreciated it, but also didn't need it because they had the supportive family that they engaged in the consent process anyway. So we conducted these interviews with 19 youth and then conducted a patient-engaged reflexive thematic analysis. Thematic analysis is a commonly used qualitative method. The reflexive component is sort of the researcher taking into consideration their own positionality and bias and how that might impact both the creation of the data through the interview process, but also the analysis of the data. I felt this was really important as a cisgender woman who was the primary data analyst for this study, that I acknowledge, my positionality as a researcher, clinician, and a human being, and the bias that comes along with that. But also, I worked very closely with a lived experience partner who was involved in the study right from its inception all the way through to the end, and continues to be very involved in our research. And they sort of co-analyzed the data with me and gave a really helpful perspective and lived experience lens on what they were seeing in the data, how that related to their experience and their understanding of that community. And it was an incredibly fulfilling process that I would love to see happening more often, because I could offer sort of the research clinical perspective and the understanding of how the data analysis would proceed. But I really don't think it would look at all the same way if we hadn't had that really valuable lived experience perspective. I know this font is small. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, mostly just to say that we had quite a diverse sample in terms of gender identity. We had some diversity in ethnicity that was kind of roughly approximating the population in BC. Diversity in the type of pain, and co-occurring medical, neurodevelopmental, and psychiatric conditions. And one thing I'll just point out that I think is relevant for future research, and this was actually the reason we did this, was a suggestion from our lived experience partner. We separated out asking about family socioeconomic status and personal financial situation, recognizing that if an individual isn't out to their family, or their family is not supportive of them in relation to their gender identity or their pain, that they may have means as a family that individual youth may not have access to if they're seeking out their own healthcare or gender transition. So there were three themes that we identified from this qualitative analysis. The first was this idea of fighting for legitimacy, so that young people who were gender diverse and live with chronic pain didn't always feel like they were visible, they weren't represented in healthcare settings, that it's a very vulnerable experience to disclose your gender identity, especially when you're seeking healthcare for something else, and that they often felt invalidated, or that opportunities where they experienced validation were really powerful for them. And this tension would come up where young people described that, even though their identity and their perspectives were being invalidated, they were also expected to play this expert role when they were in healthcare settings. So, they would be kind of simultaneously told that what they were experiencing wasn't real, but then also being asked to educate their health provider about what it means to be trans or to be undergoing gender affirming medical care. And I think this was summed up really nicely by this quote from one of our participants, where they said, "I'm 17, I'm not fully developed in any way, but I'm expected to explain every nuance of being trans to every person I meet who finds out that I'm trans." The second theme was around this idea that you can affirm your gender or you can manage your pain, but it's very challenging to do both at the same time. Some young people talked about sort of the embodied experience of gender and pain, where sometimes it felt like their body wasn't worth taking care of because it didn't feel like them. So it was harder to engage in pain management in that way. Some young people talked about adopting gendered pain behaviors as a way of affirming their identity. So a lot of transmasculine youth said, in an attempt to try and make sure that the people around me understand that I'm male, I hide my pain. I don't ask for help and support because that's what boys and men do. And if I were to give that up and ask for help, that would mean going against my gender identity. And the thing that I thought was really fascinating about this is this was described by many of our participants, and the majority of them qualified it by saying, I know that these gender stereotypes don't make sense and they're harmful, and I understand where they come from. They come from the patriarchy or other societal constructs, and I still have to adhere to them, which I think is a really interesting insight that they can know this is not helpful for me and it's necessary, and in some cases necessary for my safety to not out myself. This was also an area where a lot of young people talked about the impact of chest binding as being a particular source of pain that was very relevant, and that again, sort of being torn between the option of not chest binding and not affirming their gender identity, but then having pain relief from not binding. Generally, it wasn't even seen as an option for most young people. The binding was necessary for their mental health. But this is one quote that I think sums all of this up really nicely. This young person said, "Being youth and being queer, everyone just questions whether or not I really know myself or they know me better." So that sort of harkens back to that first theme. And as soon as I go outside of what they expect a boy to do, they're like, "Okay, but now were you really a boy? Because if you're in pain, boys don't feel pain. Get over yourself." So I've gone out of my way to stop vocalizing my pain and simply live with it, just so I won't be questioned on if I know who I am. And the final theme was around intersecting identities and social context. Many youth talked about how, just looking at their pain and their gender identity wasn't enough to explain their lived experience. And young people talked about the role of race and culture, the role of socioeconomic status. The identity that was raised most frequently was neurodiversity, and about a third of our sample identified as being neurodiverse, most identifying as having autism. And then they also talked about how, sort of having safe spaces and people that appreciate and understand these intersections and support these intersections really made a difference. So this young person said a lot of stuff like autism or ADHD has a lot to do with sensory stuff or routines. So having everything upended by pain and then having everything upended by gender, again, it can be very confusing, especially with a lot of neurodivergency. You're not very good at talking to people, so it can make doctor's appointments that much worse. So I think this really illustrates the importance of being able to take some of those intersectional perspectives, because some of the unique challenges that youth who identified as neurodiverse were experiencing really required understanding those three aspects of their identity in conjunction. So just in conclusion for this, this study, I had really hoped to walk away from this with some very specific, tangible recommendations for how health professionals can approach gender diverse youth who live with chronic pain. And I was maybe not entirely surprised, but disappointed to find that what most youth were asking for, it was just basic principles of respect. And it was somewhat disheartening to hear how uncommon that was in the experiences of these young people. And this is also considering that these are young people who live in BC, where there is good access to trans healthcare, and they're not living in environments where sort of the socio-political climate is front and center for their experience, but this was a common experience of being sort of invalidated, not taken seriously, and not being treated with respect. And within that, I think it's important to recognize that trans and gender diverse youth are not a monolith. So, there's diversity within gender diversity, and diversity within those youth's experiences and preferences. And so, some youth really appreciate being asked their pronouns, and some youth feel that when a health professional asks their pronouns, it signals to them that there's something different about me, and that's why they're asking. So, the best way I can sort of sum up what these young people are asking for is just for providers to educate themselves and to approach with humility and an openness and curiosity to what each individual youth's preferences are. There's lots that were raised during the study that spoke to concerns that are present also in cisgender youth, but understanding that specific intersection with minority stressors is important. We need more education and research on some of these gender diversity specific pain concerns, especially those that impact gender expression. So maybe more threatening to, we can't just say, don't bind. It's just not an option for some of these youth. And a need for increased research on neurodiversity. So I'm going to very quickly, in the last few minutes, just talk about some kind of emerging research that my group is doing on neurodiversity and chronic pain in youth to try and build on what we learned from this study. And, there is already work that's been done that really highlights the importance of considering neurodiversity and chronic pain. We know that autistic individuals in particular experience more pain than neurotypical. There can be both hypo and hyper responsivity to pain, and also just generally more heterogeneity in how pain is experienced and expressed. And we know that disparity between autistic and non-autistic youth is more pronounced in relation to their pain among children who have a co-occurring developmental condition, so cerebral palsy, epilepsy, intellectual disability. Autistic children tend to have more accidents and also more co-occurring conditions that can be associated with pain, particularly GI conditions. And because pain assessment and pain treatment are really social processes, the social communication differences associated with autism mean that these young people are often at risk for their pain to be undermanaged. This is also relevant from the sex and gender perspective. So, I hope that what I've just presented sort of makes the case for why it's important to look at that intersection of neurodiversity and gender diversity. But we also know that there's differences in how autism presents between boys and girls, just generally, and that also impacts sort of a diagnostic bias, and that it's more likely for girls to be diagnosed much later into adolescence or adulthood. That they tend to have less of those kind of externalizing symptoms that would be picked up as a flag for assessment. And so they don't receive treatment or support for their autism until much later. And also that, there's more clinically significant autistic traits amongst girls with chronic pain than boys. And some recent estimates I've seen has estimated that it is approximately a quarter of young people who present to chronic pain clinics have either a diagnosis of autism or clinically significant symptoms of autism. So this is not an insignificant problem by any stretch of the imagination. We have a paper under review right now where we looked at all of the literature that was available on treating chronic pain in autistic youth and found that research is incredibly low quality. It's mostly case reports. Many of those studies didn't even tend to look at chronic pain. It just happened to be a feature of what else they were reporting in that case report. And then we also reviewed all of the randomized control trials in Cochrane reviews for the treatment of chronic pain, both the pharmacological treatment, psychological and physical therapies. And what we found is that the majority of randomized control trials that make their way into Cochrane reviews contain an implicit exclusion criteria against autistic youth. So this might be things like having a requirement that participants are engaged verbally, that they have no co-occurring conditions, that they can comply with protocols exactly as given. and that a smaller proportion of studies had explicit exclusion criteria, so saying, children with developmental disabilities or with autism can't participate. So there's this pattern of sort of underrepresentation, and I think it's not all that surprising given the heterogeneity associated with autism, but it's clear that we need to do better. We need to be thinking, are RCTs the best way of examining treatments for such a heterogeneous population? How can we make our research more inclusive? So this has been something that I've been trying to address and sort of started building with my postdoc mentor, Tim Oberlander, during my fellowship. We now co-lead this program called the Living Lab at Home, which is intended to try and make child health research more accessible to children across the developmental spectrum. And we have a series of papers coming out. So this first one was published last year. We describe our patient engagement efforts where we worked with families who had pain, autism, cerebral palsy, and/or severe neurologic impairment to find out what they needed from in-home research to be more accessible. And the biggest thing we heard from families was that they need flexibility, they need options, they can't always adhere to a very specific protocol, especially if there's things like we asked about the use of wearables as one means of collecting data. And a lot of families said, well, that's great, but if you don't have options that might accommodate my child's sensory sensitivity, they're never going to put it on. And this really highlighted for us the need for, we talk a lot about trauma-informed care, and I think we also really need trauma-informed research. A lot of families talked about having had past negative medical experiences and that contributing to their reluctance to engage in research, especially if they perceive that that research wasn't going to be able to accommodate their child's needs. The other thing that we really heard was that families wanted a reciprocal relationship with the research team and that they wanted to be able to interact with their data and benefit from the data collection they're engaging in, and also to be able to inform research questions. So we took everything that we learned, and if you're interested in the paper, we give some more kind of specific details of what this would actually look like kind of tangibly if you were applying methods to these populations. But we also did a small pilot study where we, integrated the feedback that we received from that engagement into a protocol where we kind of tried to experiment with flexibility and how much can we be flexible in our protocol while still getting meaningful data. And so in that paper, we report some very tangible recommendations for researchers that we learned from this process to hopefully help continue to iterate on methods. And it's a combination of both kind of quantitatively looking at the quality of the data that we got and how much data we got, but also qualitative experiences from families. And we also include a little bit of data around what that actually meant for the research team, like how many hours of research assistant time did we need to support families in having these protocols, and just to really hopefully give researchers some sense of sort of what to plan for if they're trying to do a more accessible and inclusive study. And then finally, we really took to heart that feedback from families that they want to be able to see their data when they're collecting it for research purposes. That might really motivate their engagement. And so we developed a data visualization platform that both kind of collects data from families, but feeds it back to them in real time. And we completed a trial recently looking at how families experience that. And for the most part, it seems to be very helpful for motivating engagement in both research and care. And in terms of some things that we have in progress, one is now adapting that data visualization platform to be tested specifically in autistic youth with chronic pain to see if that can help promote their self-management and to see if they interact with their data in the same way, or if they have some specific needs where we can build in some flexibility into the protocol. We have both a qualitative and a quantitative study underway looking at experiences of pain in autistic youth, looking specifically at things like sensory experiences, masking or camouflaging of autistic traits, and also how autistic youth experience things like diagnostic uncertainty and gendered expectations of pain. And then the last project we have ongoing that I'm quite excited about, because I've never done anything like this before, but we have access in BC to this very large administrative health database that basically contains data from the entire population of BC and their health encounters and diagnoses and prescriptions dispensed. And we know that that there's a reliable algorithm for identifying which young people within that database have an autism diagnosis. What we don't know is whether we can use that data to determine who has chronic pain, and whether whether it looks the same trying to identify the presence of chronic pain in an administrative health database for non-autistic and autistic youth. So that's underway, and I'm quite excited about that, because if we can find a way of doing that, then that opens up a whole realm of possibilities of ways that we can use that big data. And I'll just end by thanking you so much for the invitation to be here and for your attention, for my wonderful collaborators. I always am thrilled to collaborate on any work or just to chat about how we can be doing health research more equitably. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berner, for that great presentation and sharing your research with us. I think we have time to take one or two questions. So if anyone has questions, you can press the button on the microphone in front of you, and then it'll turn green when it's ready.
I have a question. Caitlin, wonderful work. And I love the project where you worked with, oh, sorry. Thanks, Fiona. Jennifer Stinson, co-director of the Pain Center. I loved your work with when you were working with patient partners to analyze the data and how they talking about their own financial wellness. And I noticed that poverty wasn't in your models. And is that supposed to be captured by socioeconomic status, or how are you capturing that?
Yeah, that's a great point. So yes, we have it listed as socioeconomic status. I have been thinking recently that those are maybe not necessarily the same thing, and especially this differentiation of of what the young person has access to. I think my patient partner is so tired of me saying this, but I on a regular basis tell them like that was such a brilliant idea, because it's really and I think it's not just relevant for trans and gender diverse youth. I think any youth who is not in a supportive family situation, we just can't assume based on our usual metrics for SES, which would be things like parent education or parent income. That's not necessarily going to be a good proxy. So I think it's worth a kind of bigger discussion about how we're measuring that, or at least making a practice of splitting that out.
I don't know how this thing works. Okay. Hi, I'm Lauren, co-chair of the Patient Caregiver Advisory Committee. Great presentation. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us. I just had a quick question on engagement. So you had mentioned that it was kind of interesting for you guys when you were realizing that your sample would be very biased if you just pulled directly from your clinic and the partners that you had access to. So I'm just curious some of the strategies that you did to kind of get those individuals who weren't coming up specifically, and how to get that broader reach into the community.
So we were shameless. If any of you were at the crosstalk yesterday, I've recently embraced being shameless about promoting things that I'm kind of passionate about. So one of the really helpful things is that there's a network of providers within BC, Transcare BC, that anybody who provides any type of gender affirming care in the province, including counselors and social workers. So it's not just those providing medical care. So there was a network of folks connected through that sort of spread the word about this research and shared it within community organizations that they were aware of. We also reached out to some community organizations who work specifically with these young people to share through those venues. And then we also really benefited from, not necessarily always word of mouth, but from suggestions from the young people that we had recruited about the places that they find community and allyship. And that gave us a lot of additional ideas of where these youth are kind of connecting. And that was, it was really, it was a very interesting process of thinking outside of what we would consider a convenient sample, and tapping into some of those community resources.
Thank you, Kathleen, for such amazing presentation. My name is Lanore Tunji Ajayi from Sickle Cell Awareness Group of Ontario. I wanted to commend you on this study. I've been part of many advisory councils or studies and discussions around pain, chronic pain, but I find that not many people are talking about kids with autism that have special needs and understanding that they also feel pain, especially those kids with autism that might also be nonverbal. How do they communicate their pain? And so I think more work needs to be done in this area, but I want to commend you for the work you've done. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's, I think it's an emerging community of folks who are doing this work. And I think it really, it has benefited so much being guided by folks with lived experience and some lived experience researchers who've been really championing this. I'm excited to see where it goes, because I think it's not only going to help the care and treatment of young people with autism, but I think it's also just going to generally help make our research more accessible. And a very wise person I had the privilege to do some work with out in BC said to me once, if you build something for the most marginalized community, then it's going to work for everyone. And I hope we can take that, approach not only for families with autism, but for who live at other marginalized identities.
Given the interest in time, we want to thank our speaker today and the great discussion. And then Caitlin's going to be here for a little bit more. So if you're interested, you can always come down and have a discussion as well. So we're going to move on to our next moderator and speaker.